Take your old dog and get out right now. My daughter-in-law had just pointed into the darkness and screamed in my face. The rain that night at Nashville was nothing like the gentle showers back home in Harlan County. It was icy cold. It ached like a rusty nail driven deep into the worn joints of a 70-year-old carpenter. I stood on the front steps. Rainwater poured from the roof straight onto my face. The wind whistled through the crack in the door like mocking laughter. Max, my aging sheepdog, huddled against my worn-out boots. He was trembling. So was I. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. The expensive oak door swung open. Warm, yellow light spilled from inside, but it wasn't meant for me. Vanessa stood there. My daughter-in-law. Her face was beautiful but cold, like a slab of granite without a trace of human warmth. She threw my worn canvas bag onto the rain-soaked lawn. I looked at my only son. Daniel stood behind his wife. He avoided my eyes. The hands I had once taught to hold a wood plane now hung uselessly at his sides. The child I had cherished every day of his life now stood there watching his own father being thrown out without the slightest compassion. I knew I could not compromise any longer. I decided to give him a warning. I pulled a folder from my rain-soaked coat pocket. It was a copy of the original financial agreement. I handed it to Daniel. The moment my son saw the last page of that document, he staggered backward. "No, this can't be happening," Daniel stammered. His face turned pale beneath the living room lights. But it was already too late. Their cruelty had reached the limit of what a father could endure. I said nothing. I turned and walked away into the pitch-black curtain of rain. I knew one thing for certain. Defective wood must be carved away. This betrayal would come at a price. I led Max down the deserted road. Each raindrop lashed against my face. My mind drifted back 30 years to a small woodworking shop in Kentucky. That was where this story truly began. The place where I raised a son with the scent of oak wood and the value of honesty, only to be repaid with cold indifference on a bitter rain-soaked night like this. Amid the howling rain along the Nashville highway, my mind was filled with the scent of the past. It was the smell of freshly cut pine, the sweet aroma of ripe cherry wood, and the salty scent of sweat from years of hard labor in Harlan County, a poor corner of Kentucky, yet rich in loyalty and heart. That was where I once had a home. I had Margaret, my late wife, whose smile was as warm as the morning sun. And I had Daniel, my little boy who always clung to my shirt and begged me to teach him how to carve his first toys. My small woodworking shop sat at the foot of a hill. Life revolved around pieces of timber. I always told Daniel when he sat on a pile of wood shavings, wood is honest. If you make a crooked cut, it will show immediately. You can't hide a crack beneath a glossy coat of paint. Oak is always strong. Pine is always flexible. People are the same way. I used the honesty of wood grain to teach him about character. I wanted him to grow into an honorable man, a man with a core as solid as an ancient tree standing in the forests of Kentucky. When Margaret became ill and passed away, my world collapsed. It was just Daniel and me after that. I poured all my love into him, working myself to exhaustion from dawn until moonrise so he could have an education. Daniel was smart. He was accepted into a prestigious university in the city to study finance. The day he packed his bags and left home, I hugged him. I could still smell the familiar scent of oak on his jacket. I believed that this boy would carry the goodness of our family into a bigger world, but the city is a frightening machine. It can warp even the straightest boards. Daniel's calls home became less frequent. During the holidays, he no longer wanted to smell wood polish or hear the whine of saws. He began talking about money, about luxurious social circles, about the skyscrapers of Nashville. I listened in silence. I told myself my son was simply growing up. I had no idea that the core inside him was rotting away day by day. Then one day Daniel came home with a city girl named Vanessa. She wore high heels and looked at my woodworking shop with contempt in her eyes. Daniel glanced at me hesitantly. He said he wanted to buy a large house in Nashville so he could get married, but he did not have enough money for the down payment. He dropped to his knees and begged for my help. A father's love blinded me. I decided to do something no one in the Miller family had ever imagined. I decided to sell our ancestral land, the place that held the soul of my workshop and the last memories of Margaret. I had no idea that this very decision would leave me with nowhere left to go. The 40-acre piece of ancestral land in Harlan County was a priceless treasure. It was where ancient oak trees had taken root through 3 generations. I knew every inch of that soil. I could recognize every tree by heart. But Daniel's tears and desperate pleas clouded the judgment of an old carpenter like me. I agreed to sell it. A land broker from the city came and offered $47,000. To me, that money was blood flesh, the entirety of my past with Margaret. I placed the cash into an old leather envelope, with one purpose only to help my son have a home of his own. On the day I was preparing to sign the transfer papers, Ruth, my longtime neighbor and the best friend of my late wife, came to the workshop. She saw the stack of documents on the table. She saw the dark circles under my eyes from worry. Ruth placed a hand on my shoulder. Her voice lowered with concern. "Are you sure about this, George?" she asked. Then she continued, "People in the city change quickly, especially your future daughter-in-law. I've seen the way she looks at this workshop. That's not the look of someone who will cherish your family." I simply smiled and waved away her concerns. I trusted the Miller blood running through Daniel's veins. I believed that good timber could never produce termites. I signed the papers selling the land. I gathered all $47,000 and brought it to Nashville for Daniel. Needless to say, my son was overjoyed. He threw his arms around me. He made all kinds of promises. Vanessa smiled brightly as well. She even offered to make tea for me herself. The atmosphere was so artificial, yet at the time I was too naive to see it. A few days later, before buying the house, Daniel brought me a document. He said it was a routine administrative requirement from the bank. It was a promissory note clearly stating that I had loaned him $47,000. I stared at my son in surprise. Since when did a father and son need something so cold and formal between them? Daniel scratched his head awkwardly and smiled. He said it was only a formality to make the mortgage application look better for the bank. He told me to sign it and assured me it carried no real obligation between father and son. I looked at the document. A sense of unease stirred inside me, the same feeling you get when you catch the scent of wood rotting from the inside. But Daniel's pleading eyes won once again. I picked up the pen and signed that unnecessary promissory note. I had no idea that my signature was the first hammer blow Daniel and Vanessa would use to shatter my life. They had turned a father's love into a sharp weapon. And the truth behind that promissory note was so disgusting that, had I known in advance, I would have burned every dollar of that money before ever placing it in the hands of my treacherous son. Daniel and Vanessa's new house in Nashville was enormous. It was painted a brilliant white, luxurious, and located in an upscale neighborhood. But to me, the place had no warmth. It felt as cold as a warehouse filled with corpses. At Daniel's earnest invitation, I moved in with them after selling off my woodworking shop back home. I brought Max with me. He was the last link between me and my late wife. But from the very first day I stepped through that door, I realized I was an unwanted presence. Vanessa made no effort to hide her dislike for me and for Max. She frowned at my faded coat. She shouted whenever Max accidentally left muddy paw prints on the polished floors. Daniel saw everything, but he chose silence. He pretended to focus on his computer screen. The principled son I had once raised had become a weak man who constantly bowed to his wealthy wife. I began to notice the hidden cracks in that house. In woodworking, a small crack in a piece of timber, if left untreated, can ruin an entire board. It spreads, eating away at the structure from the inside until the whole piece snaps in two. Daniel's transformation was that crack. He began speaking to me with irritation and disrespect. He complained about living expenses. He looked at me as a financial burden, rather than the father who had sacrificed his entire fortune for him. Vanessa became worse with each passing day. She deliberately fed Max spoiled leftovers. She turned off the heater in my small basement room during the freezing winter nights. I endured it all. I told myself that for my son's happiness I could tolerate any humiliation. I washed clothes, cleaned the house, and maintained the yard like an unpaid servant. I did everything I could to smooth over the rough edges and preserve this fragile illusion of harmony. But human greed and cruelty are bottomless pits. They did not just want me to be their servant. Late one evening, when Daniel and Vanessa believed I was asleep in the basement, the sound of their argument drifted down through the gaps in the wooden floor. I heard Vanessa crying and Daniel speaking in a sharp, frustrated tone. Curious, I quietly climbed the stairs. I stood behind the living room door and listened. What I overheard froze me to the core. It was far beyond anything I could have imagined. I stood frozen behind the living room door. Vanessa's voice reached my ears sharp as a razor blade. She was talking about me. She was talking about the $47,000. I looked through the crack in the door. Daniel was sitting on the sofa with his head buried in his hands. Vanessa paced back and forth. The screen of her phone glowed brightly in her hand. She slammed it down onto the table. She said the down payment for the house could not be treated as a gift. The bank was reviewing their mortgage application. They needed proof that it was a legitimate loan in order to reduce taxes and increase their credit limit. Daniel looked up at his wife, his voice trembling. He said he could not force his father to do something like that. But Vanessa merely sneered. Her voice dropped to a harsh whisper as she spoke to him. A 70-year-old man who's losing his mind will do anything if you say it the right way. I went numb. So the promissory note from years ago had never been an administrative formality. It was a carefully planned legal trap. I wanted to believe I had heard her wrong, but I had not. They had planned everything before they even came back to my hometown. They used the money from the sale of my land as the down payment. Then they intended to use that promissory note to turn me into their debtor through hidden penalty clauses. They wanted to throw me out of the house the moment all the paperwork was finalized. I could not believe what I was seeing. The son I had carried in my heart all my life, the boy I had raised on the honesty of oak wood, was now helping his wife tear apart the last hard-earned dollars his father possessed. The pain seeped into my bones. I staggered backward, trying not to make a sound. If you've made it this far, then perhaps this story has caught your interest. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me how you think this story will end to see whether your prediction is right. A lot of people watch without doing that, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to us. I returned to the cold basement room. I held Max tightly in my arms. The betrayal was too great. Rotten wood cannot remain in a house. I decided not to confront them immediately. I needed to recover what was rightfully mine first. But before I could make a move, disaster struck. The very next morning after Daniel left for work, Vanessa staged an incident. She falsely accused Max of tearing her expensive dress, and that became the excuse for them to coldly throw Max and me out into the Nashville storm that night. They thought I was penniless and helpless. But at the very moment when I felt most defeated, an old friend appeared. And with that arrival came the unveiling of a secret that even Daniel had never known. The Nashville night seemed determined to swallow Max and me whole. Rain poured relentlessly from the sky, blurring the faint glow of the streetlights. My clothes were soaked through, clinging to my freezing skin. Max trembled beside me. He no longer had the strength to bark. I held my canvas bag tightly against my chest. Inside were the documents and the phone containing their cruel messages. I wandered without direction. The pain in my heart cut deeper than the cold rain. I had given away everything only to be repaid with a merciless rejection from my only son. Just when I thought I might collapse on the sidewalk, a bright beam of light appeared behind me. The low rumble of a car engine echoed through the storm. A luxurious black sedan slowly pulled over beside me. The tinted window rolled down. A familiar face appeared beneath the glow of the headlights. It was Howard Bennett. He had been my closest friend since childhood, and was now a retired senior attorney in the city. Howard stared at me in shock. He immediately threw open the car door and rushed out into the rain. Howard helped me into the vehicle. He turned the heater to its highest setting and handed me a dry towel. Max collapsed onto the floorboard, soaking in the warmth. Howard took one look at my miserable condition and slammed his fist against the steering wheel. He demanded to know what had happened. I remained silent for a long moment before handing him the folder. I told him how Daniel and Vanessa had thrown me out of the house because of a fraudulent promissory note. Howard listened carefully. His face hardened, and his eyes burned with anger. Howard did not take me to a hotel. Instead, he drove me directly to his private office in downtown Nashville. He opened a large safe in the corner of the room and removed a thick file yellowed with age. He placed it on the desk in front of me. Howard said it was time for me to face the truth. The file contained records of royalty payments accumulated over the past 30 years. A deferred compensation account from a luxury woodworking design project for major corporations that I had entrusted to Howard's firm decades earlier. I opened the file. The figures listed under the asset statement made the room seem to tilt around me. The amount was enormous, many times greater than the $47,000 I had received from selling the land. I had never touched the money because I had wanted to live a simple life back in my hometown. I was not poor the way Daniel and Vanessa believed. I was a quiet millionaire. Howard looked at me, his voice firm and unyielding. Your patience ends here, George. It's time to make them pay through the law. I nodded. Rotten wood must be carved away cleanly. But Howard's plan went far beyond recovering my money. He had already contacted a powerful woman, the sharpest instrument of justice he knew, a woman whose name alone was enough to make Nashville's financial elite tremble with fear. The next morning, Howard Bennett's office welcomed a very special visitor. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She was known as the scourge of Nashville's fraudulent financial world. Eleanor entered the room with an icy presence. Her black suit was perfectly pressed. Her hair was tied neatly into a tight bun. Her sharp eyes seemed capable of seeing through every hidden corner like a microscope. To me, Eleanor resembled the finest steel chisel in a woodworking shop, sharp, precise, professional, and always ready to carve away deception to reveal the true grain beneath. Eleanor did not waste a single second. She sat across from me, opened her laptop, and asked for every document I had. I handed her the copy of the promissory note Daniel had tricked me into signing along with the phone containing the cruel messages from that night. Eleanor examined each page carefully. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the wooden desk. Not a single expression crossed her cold face. Her silence made the atmosphere in the room so tense it felt difficult to breathe. After 10 minutes of review, Eleanor closed the file. A faint smile appeared on her lips. Her voice was crisp and direct without a single unnecessary word. She said Daniel and Vanessa had made a fatal mistake because of their own ignorance. In order to legitimize the $47,000 with the bank for mortgage purposes, Daniel had signed a declaration stating that the money was a non-refundable gift from his father. Yet in the promissory note they had pressured me into signing. They described the same money as a loan subject to penalties and conditions. Eleanor explained that this constituted serious mortgage document fraud. It was a federal criminal offense. They had effectively created evidence against themselves with their own hands. But that was not all. Eleanor looked me in the eye and continued referring to the text messages stored on my phone. Those messages demonstrated planning, coordination, and deliberate intent to deceive and remove an elderly man from his home. They believed I was nothing more than an ignorant old countryman who knew nothing about the law, which was why they had acted so boldly. Eleanor rose from her chair and organized the documents into her leather briefcase. She looked at me with unwavering determination. She promised to turn their promissory note into a self-inflicted conviction. Justice would be sharpened until it reclaimed every dollar of my hard-earned money and restored my honor. Eleanor told me to prepare myself for a fierce battle in court. But before the trial could even begin, the first domino in Eleanor's plan had already been set in motion behind the scenes. It was aimed directly at the thing Daniel valued most, a move that would push my ungrateful son's life toward a devastating catastrophe before he even realized what was happening. Attorney Eleanor Hayes's plan unfolded with the speed and precision of a master craftsman's saw. The first domino fell on an ordinary Tuesday. A short video appeared on social media. It showed Max and me being thrown out of the house during a storm. A dash cam from a vehicle accidentally parked across from the house had captured the entire incident. Vanessa's cruel words were heard clearly. Daniel's helpless and cold expression was visible beneath the streetlights. The cruelty of the scene immediately ignited a fierce wave of outrage across social media. The video quickly spread and eventually reached the executive board of the major financial firm where Daniel worked. For an investment management company, reputation and employee ethics are matters of survival. That very morning, as soon as Daniel walked into the office, he was handed a termination notice effective immediately. All of his accounts and bonus payments were frozen pending an internal investigation into possible document fraud. My arrogant son lost everything within a matter of hours. But his tragedy was far from over. The true nature of rotten timber always reveals itself when the floodwaters rise. Vanessa, the wife he had spoiled and for whom he had betrayed his own father, finally revealed her true face. The moment she learned that Daniel had been fired and was facing the possibility of financial ruin, she did not wait even a single day. Vanessa immediately packed all her clothes, expensive handbags, and valuable possessions into suitcases. She was preparing to abandon the magnificent White House in Nashville. Daniel rushed home and found the bedroom in chaos. He grabbed hold of his wife's legs and begged her to stay so they could weather the storm together. But Vanessa coldly pulled away from him. She looked at him with utter contempt. Then she delivered a sentence that crushed the last remnants of his pride. "I'm not foolish enough to sign on for a ride to the bottom with a sinking ship." She walked straight out the door, leaving Daniel collapsed on the floor of an empty house. My son was left penniless, alone, and desperate inside the very home he had obtained through his own betrayal. I watched everything from a distance through Eleanor's reports. Part of me felt satisfaction, yet another part still carried the sorrow of a father. The piece of timber I had devoted my life to shaping had rotted completely from within. But this was only the beginning of their downfall. The largest domino had yet to fall. 1 week later, a federal court summons was delivered directly into Daniel's hands. He would be forced to face me from the defendant's table. And during that trial, another explosive secret uncovered by Eleanor would be revealed, making Daniel realize that losing his job and losing his wife were nothing compared to the terrifying price the law was about to make him pay. The courtroom of the federal courthouse in Nashville carried an almost suffocating sense of solemnity. Rows of polished oak benches stretched across the room. The towering walls stood cold and imposing. This was a place where polished lies had no place to hide. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside attorney Eleanor Hayes and Howard Bennett. Max had been allowed to wait outside in the hallway. Across the courtroom sat Daniel. He was completely alone at the defendant's table. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. Not a single close friend had come to support him. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark with exhaustion and filled with panic. The trial began with the firm voice of the elderly judge. One by one, Eleanor presented the evidence before the court. Bank transaction records, the degrading text messages used to plan my removal from the house, and most importantly, the gift declaration Daniel himself had signed and submitted to the lending institution. The truth was peeled back layer by layer, exposed and painful like a board cut in half, to reveal the rot hidden deep within its core. Daniel could only sit there with his head lowered. His shoulders trembled uncontrollably. Faced with such airtight legal evidence, he had no defense. The judge lightly tapped his wooden gavel against the bench and fixed Daniel with a stern gaze. He ordered him to stand. Then he asked whether Daniel admitted that the promissory note he had pressured his father into signing was a fraudulent document. Daniel looked up at me. His eyes were red and swollen, filled with regret that had arrived far too late. His voice cracked as he quietly confessed everything. He admitted that he had exploited his father's trust and love for financial gain. He admitted that the promissory note was entirely invalid. After a brief deliberation, the judge rose to deliver his decision. He ruled completely in favor of George Miller. The court declared the fraudulent promissory note null and void. Daniel was ordered to repay the full $47,000 along with accrued interest. But the consequences did not end there. Because of the criminal nature of the mortgage fraud, Daniel was sentenced to 2 years of probation and required to complete 300 hours of community service. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom like the final note of a solemn hymn. Justice had been carried out fairly and decisively. The pressure and anguish that had weighed on me for months vanished in an instant. I looked at my only son as he collapsed back into his chair in defeat. The truth had prevailed, yet the heart of a father could not celebrate completely. The rotten wood had been carved away, but the scar remained. The trial ended. People quietly filed out of the courtroom. I led Max toward the courthouse doors, ready to close this dark chapter of my life forever. But the moment I stepped onto the courthouse steps, Daniel came running from behind. Before the crowd gathered outside, he dropped to his knees at my feet. Tears streamed down his face. And there, beneath the watchful eyes of strangers, began one final conversation between father and son. A conversation that would force me to decide what kind of future, if any, remained for him. Daniel collapsed at my feet on the courthouse steps. He was sobbing uncontrollably. His thin hands clung tightly to the hem of my faded pants. He begged for forgiveness. He said he had lost everything. No job. No wife. The magnificent house would soon be repossessed by the bank. Now he had only one person left in the world, his father. He wanted to return to the woodworking shop in Harlan County. He wanted a chance to start over. I looked at my only son. My heart tightened with pain sharp as the cut of a saw blade. I helped him to his feet. Then I looked directly into his tear-filled eyes. I told him that I forgave him as a father, but I would never again enable his mistakes. I would not use the $47,000 to save his house or pay his debts. He would have to accept responsibility before the law and learn to stand on his own 2 feet. I told Daniel something I had learned over the course of my life. Love without boundaries is not love. It is the habit of losing yourself. A good father is not someone who endlessly tolerates and covers up the rot in his children. Sometimes to save an oak tree, you must have the courage to cut away the decayed branches. Daniel lowered his head. He had finally learned the most expensive lesson of his life. I'm glad you stayed with us until the end of this story. Join the Dad's real-life revenge community by hitting the like and subscribe buttons to enjoy more gripping family-centered stories in the future. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. I turned and walked away, leading Max toward Howard's car. Together we returned home to Harlan County. I opened the door to the old woodworking shop once more. The familiar scent of oak and pine rushed toward me, embracing me like one of Margaret's warm hugs. I picked up my wood plane. The sound of the saw echoed through the workshop once again. Beside my loyal dog Max, I finally found true peace. The grain of my life had been carved clean once more. Truth and justice had restored peace to my soul.